If you like our video, click the button to subscribe to our channel and get easy access to new content. To see our full suite of ad-free video courses, instruction manuals, and quick reference guides, visit us at www.teachucomp.com. A pivot chart in Excel shows data the same way a pivot table does, but graphically. You can create a pivot chart in Excel independently from or along with an associated pivot table in Excel. You can also add a pivot chart to an existing pivot table if you didn't create one when you initially created the pivot table. After adding a pivot chart, you can then manipulate it the same way you manipulate a pivot table. Like pivot tables, first select a cell in your workbook to help Excel set either the data source location or the pivot chart location before inserting the pivot chart. If you intend to use a single Excel table or cell range as the data source, then either click into the table to use as the data source, or click into the cell where you want to insert the upper left corner of the pivot chart or pivot table and pivot chart. Alternatively, if you intend to use an external data source or tables added to Excel's data model, instead select the cell where you want to insert the upper left corner of the pivot chart or pivot table and pivot chart. To then create a pivot chart in Excel, click the Pivot Chart drop-down button in the Charts button group on the Insert tab of the ribbon. To insert only a pivot chart, then select the Pivot Chart choice. Alternatively, to insert a pivot table and pivot chart, select the Pivot Chart and Pivot Table choice. Excel then opens the Create Pivot Chart dialog box if only inserting a pivot chart, or the Create Pivot Table dialog box if inserting both objects. The choices in both dialog boxes are the same. First, select the data source for the pivot chart from the Choose the Data that you want to analyze section. If you initially selected a cell in a table, then the Select a Table or Range option appears selected, and the table name or cell range reference appears in the Table/Range field. Alternatively, to select a single table or cell range as the pivot chart's data source if desired, select the Select a Table or Range option. Then click the Collapse Expand dialog box button at the right end of the Table/Range field to collapse it. Then click and drag over the table or cell range to use. Then click the same button again to expand the dialog box. Alternatively, to select an external data connection as the pivot chart's data source, select the Use an External Data Source option. To then choose the external data connection to use, click the Choose Connection button to open the Existing Connections dialog box. The Connections tab of the Existing Connections dialog box shows any available external data connections for this Excel workbook, your network, or your computer. To show all the data connections in your workbook, network, and computer in 3 separate sections, use the Show drop-down at the top of the Connections tab in the Existing Connections dialog box to select the All Connections choice. Then select the external data connection to use for your pivot chart from the connections shown. Alternatively, to select to use the tables in the workbook's data model or a single Excel table from any opened Excel workbook as the pivot chart's data source, click the Tables tab at the top of the Existing Connections dialog box. Then select either an individual table from any opened Excel workbook, or select the Tables and Workbook Data Model choice to select all the tables in the data model. After making your data choice selection on either tab, then click the Open button to return to the Create Pivot Chart or Create Pivot Table dialog box. Alternatively, to select the workbook's data model as the data source for the pivot chart, select the Use this workbook's data model option. After selecting the data source for the pivot chart or pivot table and pivot chart, then select its location within the Choose where you want the pivot chart to be placed section. If you selected the cell into which to insert the pivot chart when you started this process, the existing worksheet option should appear selected, and the selected cell reference should appear in the location field. To instead place the pivot chart into a new Excel worksheet, select the New Worksheet option button. Alternatively, to select an existing worksheet cell if needed, select the Existing Worksheet option button. Then click the adjacent Collapse Expand dialog box button at the right end of the location field to collapse the dialog box down to a single line. Then click the worksheet cell to set as the upper left corner of the pivot chart. Then click the same button again to expand the dialog box when finished. If desired, depending on your data source option selection, to also add the selected data to the Excel workbook's data model, check the Add this data to the data model checkbox. When finished, click the OK button to create the pivot chart or pivot table and pivot chart. Excel also shows the Pivot Chart Fields task pane at the right side of the workbook window. Then add fields from your data source, which appear in the large Choose Fields to Add to Report list towards the top of this task pane, to the quadrants at the bottom of the task pane as desired. You use this task pane to add and change the data fields in the pivot chart. It works the same way as the Pivot Table Fields task pane does, as we covered in the previous lesson titled Manually Creating a Pivot Table. If you inserted both a pivot table and a pivot chart, you can click to select either object in the worksheet to switch between the Pivot Table Fields task pane and the Pivot Chart Fields task pane. However, note that data added or changed within one task pane is reflected in the other as they are linked. If you select the Pivot Chart, you can add data fields into the Filters, Legend Series, Axis Categories, or Values quadrants in the Pivot Chart Fields task pane. Separately, to add a pivot chart to an existing pivot table in Excel, click into any cell within the pivot table to which to add an accompanying pivot chart. Then directly click the Pivot Chart button in the Charts button group on the Insert tab of the ribbon to open the Insert Chart dialog box. In this dialog box, select the chart type from the list at the left side of the dialog box, and then select the specific chart subtype to use for your pivot chart from the top of the right side of the dialog box. Then click the OK button to insert the selected type of pivot chart into the worksheet. Then, depending on which object is selected, use either the Pivot Table Fields or Pivot Chart Fields task pane to manipulate the pivot chart and its associated pivot table. Remember to click the subscribe button to see more of our videos. See our full suite of courses, instruction manuals, and quick reference guides at www.teachucomp.com.